Hi, I'm Ted Pattison. I'd like to welcome you to the Office Developer Screencast Virtual Tour. In this video tutorial, we're going to talk about building ASP.NET Web Parts for Windows SharePoint Services 3.0. I'm going to start by building a Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 site so that we have a place to test and debug our web part. Next, I'm going to use Visual Studio to build an ASP.NET Web Part. We're going to then deploy that in SharePoint by compiling it to the bin directory for the web application and adding an entry for a safe control into the web.config file. Finally, we're going to go to a SharePoint site and we're going to modify the web part gallery so that we can then take our web part and add it to a page for testing and debugging. Okay, we're going to begin step one by creating a new Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 site. The way that we do that is by going to the Administrative Tools group and finding the SharePoint 3.0 Central Administration web application. This application allows us to do administrative procedures, such as in this case where we want to create a new site collection. So I clicked on the Application Management tab, and if I go down to the section which is SharePoint Site Management, the very top administrative link is Create Site Collection. So I click on that, it brings me to a page that's going to allow me to type in the information about this new site collection. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a title. There's no need for a description. The second thing I do is I give it some information so it can start creating the URL where it's going to provision this site. So you can see right here that it's going to provision the site at HTTP litware server sites dev site. Now the next thing I have to care about as I start creating this new site is coming up with a user account that's going to be the owner. And so in this case right here, since I'm logged onto this box as the domain administrator, I'm just going to go ahead and make that account as the site owner. Finally, I'm going to pick a site template. Since I'm just doing some basic development work, I'm going to create a very bland site, so I'm going to use blank site as the site template. I went ahead and clicked OK, and now SharePoint is moving through the provisioning process. So it created some entries in the configuration database, some entries in a content database, to provision this new site. It provides me a link, and so now I can click on this link and track down and see the new site that was just created. So it's a little bit vanilla, it's kind of plain, but it can provide a foundation for us doing our development and testing of web parts. Notice if I go down here and click on Site Actions and click Edit Page, well, I can get to a web part zone. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to leave this behind for a second, go into Visual Studio, and create a new custom web part DLL so that we'll have a web part to put inside this zone. So let's go ahead and fire up Visual Studio. And as I start Visual Studio, I'm going to go to the File menu and I'm going to choose New Project. And I'm going to pick a generic C# class library project. And since we're working for the Litware Corporation, we'll just go ahead and name the project Litware, so we're going to build litware.dll. Now, if you've done web part development for Windows SharePoint Services v2, you probably know that the SharePoint team created a project template for you to give you a starting point for a web part DLL project. That will be something that the SharePoint team does for you in an SDK by the time Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 is released. But in the beta cycle, there is not one of those project templates, so you're going to have to create the project from scratch, which is going to be better for your understanding anyway. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the project references, and I'm going to choose Add Reference. And I'm going to add a reference to the ASP.NET DLL, system.web.dll. Once I've added a reference to system.web.dll, I can get at the ASP.NET classes that I'm going to need to create the new web part. So I'll say using, and I'll say system.web, and I'm going to import a couple different namespaces. The next one I'm going to import is system.web.ui. The next one I'm going to import is system.web.ui.webcontrols. And let's just do one more, system.web.ui.webcontrols.webparts. And that's going to hold the base class that we're going to inherit from. So let's create a simple class in here. And I'm going to go down and rename this class and the class file to hello and hello.cs. Once I've done that, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to have this class inherit from a built-in class in the ASP.NET programming model called WebPart. The ASP WebPart class was introduced in ASP 2.0 along with the other WebPart infrastructure features. And to get Hello World functionality, there's one method that I'm going to override named render contents. Now, when I implement render contents, notice that they pass me a single parameter named writer, which is of type HTML text writer, which is a common ASP.NET programming type. And one of the things it allows me to do is to write a simple message back to the user. So I'll say hi, and then I'll go ahead and include the name of the user so I can demonstrate the fact that when you program inside of a web part, you're really inside of a standard ASP.NET control. So in ASP.NET programming, when you write code behind a page, when you write code behind a server-side control, you can always get to the context object that provides a pretty nice API, including a property called user, and I can say user.identity.name, and so I can greet the user, and I can greet the user by whatever account name they're logged in as. Okay, so really this is the basic code to do an Hello World web part. Now before I compile the web part, I have to consider where the web part is going to be deployed. One option would be for me to change this DLL and to build it with a strong name so then I can compile it and install it in the global assembly cache. That's something that might be common in production. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to use a simpler technique. An alternative way to deploy a web part DLL is to put it in the bin directory for the hosting IIS web application. And if I want to do that, I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to right-click on the project and choose Properties. And I'm going to go to the Build tab. In the Build tab, we're going to go down to the Output path. And under Output path, I'll configure that to C, inetpub, www root, and there's the bin directory right there. If I don't see a bin directory, I can just go ahead and create one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change things so now when I compile this DLL, it's going to be written into the bin directory and the SharePoint runtime is going to be able to find it. Now the second step in deployment is going to be to add a safe control entry. So I'm going to have to go and say File Open, and I'm going to have to go back to that same place on the hard drive into the inetpub www root, and there's the web.config file. I'm going to open the web.config file, and I'm going to go find the safe controls. Once I've found the safe control entries, here's all the ones that Microsoft adds in by default into the web.config so they can deploy their own web controls on a production machine. I have to add a safe control entry here as well. And I'm simply going to copy one of the existing ones. So if I go ahead and copy one of these, and then I'll paste that back in, and now I'm going to go ahead and trim off the data they have in it so I can put my own data in place. Note that in all their entries, the assembly name has been added as a fully qualified four-part assembly name. And so that's what you should always do when you have assemblies that are built with strong names. Since in our quick demo, we're not going to use a strong name, we can just get away with having the assembly be the name of the DLL file minus the extension. Okay. So as long as you haven't built it with a strong name and you deployed it in the bin directory, you're going to be able to do that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to say that the namespace is litware, and I can put in for type name, I can put hello. What's also commonly done is just to have a star inside there. And what that's going to do is going to say that inside this DLL, any class that's defined inside the litware namespace is going to be declared as a safe control. And then finally, we're just going to come back here, take our web.config file, and we're going to save our entry. Once we've saved our entry, there's not even a need to do a IIS reset. ASP.NET knows that the web.config file has been updated, and it automatically recycles the application to get those changes. Okay, so now we can revisit our site and go ahead and get our web part up and running on a page. Now, in a second, I'm going to go to the web part gallery. But what I want you to see is that if I go to the home page and I go to Edit Page, and then I go back to one of these zones and I say Add Web Part, what I'm going to find is my web part won't be an option yet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this Add Web Part. And that's going to bring up this dialog of available web parts. And it's not going to be inside there because we haven't added the web part to the web part gallery yet. So in order to do that, we're going to go to the Site Actions menu and we're going to go to Site Settings. Once we go to the Site Settings page, there is a link under the Gallery section to get to the Web Parts Gallery. So I'll go ahead and click Web Parts. This takes me to a page that allows me to see the web parts that have been put into the Web Part Gallery. And I'm going to have to add an entry for my new web part. Every entry is actually an XML file. And there's two formats of the XML file. Back in V2 for SharePoint, the XML files had DWP extensions. And we see in a V3 web part gallery, by default, there's a bunch of these old DWP files in there. Those are the web parts that Microsoft has added to the gallery automatically. When ASP.NET introduced its web part infrastructure, it also has these same XML files, but the XML structure is different and the extensions now become .webpart. If I had a .webpart file that I've crafted by hand, I could go ahead and click on the Upload button and import the web part. I don't have one of those, so I'm going to use another option that was introduced with V3, and that's clicking on the New button. If I click on the New button right here, SharePoint does something really interesting. It goes and looks at the web.config file, and it basically reads all the DLLs that have safe control entries. It then loads those DLLs, and it uses reflection to go through there and find what classes have already been configured as safe controls and can be added as web parts. So this gives you a very easy way to add a web part metadata into the web part library. You can see that litware.hello showed up by default, so I'm going to choose Populate Gallery. Okay, so now I've added the web part and I can go back to the home page and add this web part. Okay, before I do that, even though this isn't necessary for the Hello World demo, I want to drill down on Edit. And if you drill down on Edit, you can see the different things that go into the web part as far as the properties that are added inside the gallery. And if you click View XML, you can also see the bare bones .webpart file that was created for you on the fly when it added this inside here. As a developer, you're going to be creating these, and notice that there's properties down here with just the minimal property of title. For instance, if you have a web part and you have a zip code custom property you've added inside there, it's also the .webpart file that you're able to put your custom default settings for those inside. Okay, now that we've added the web part, let's go ahead and cite it on the page. So we're going to come back, we're going to go back to Edit Page, and now in any web part page inside this particular site, I should be able to go and find the Hello web part. I'll go ahead and choose Add, and there's my web part inside here. If I go back into the regular display mode, get out of edit mode, I can see the way my web part will be perceived to the user. And one more final demonstration I want to do. Let's go back, and I'm going to change some code. I'm simply going to change the message from hi to hello, and I'm going to Control-Shift-B to recompile. Now I'm going to go ahead and navigate back to the browser, and I'm simply going to hit refresh. And what I want you to see is that once you compile to the bin directory, you can simply modify your code, recompile, go back to the browser, and refresh. And you're going to be able to see the new DLL is loaded in. So it just gets to be a very quick way to iterate through modifying your code, recompiling, and being able to test that.